Hey guys, Ruben here. Welcome to this 3-part beginners tutorial series in Blender. We're going to be learning in this series how to make this sushi from scratch. So I'm going to teach you how to model it, how to texture it, how to light it, and then finally how to render this. If you're new to Blender, this is going to be great for you. You're going to be learning everything from scratch. So let's get into the series. Alright, so when we open up Blender, this is what we see, just a cube, camera, and a point light. What we can do for now is we can get rid of these. For reference, this is PureRef. This is going to help us to see what we are wanting to make. I recommend that you get PureRef. It's great for using as reference when you're making new work. Before we also get started, let's just quickly go to our preferences and make sure that our tab for Power menu is on. This is going to help us navigate between object mode and edit mode much quicker instead of going to the window on the left, which is this one. So let's get rid of our cube, our camera, and our light. So we can just drag select this and then press X to delete. And let's add in a plane by pressing Shift A, plane, pressing S to scale this, and then pressing 10 by scaling it by 10 units. And then let's apply the scale by pressing Ctrl A and then scale. Alright, so this is going to be our wooden floor for our render shots. Let's add in our plate over here, our white plate. That is going to be a cylinder, and we can leave it at our default 32 vertices, and we're going to add a subdivision to this later on. So 32 is just great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press S to scale and then Z, and I'm just going to bring this a little bit thinner. I'm going to press G for grab and then Z for the Z axis, and I'm just going to bring this up just slightly. Alright, so what we can do here is let's just hide our plane for now. Let's go into our cylinder and then let's tab into edit mode, and then having our face select on by pressing 3 on our numpad or going to these 3 buttons over here. Select one of our faces and let's inset this by pressing I. Let's inset this, and there we go. And then pressing E for extrude. Let's extrude this downwards just like this until we have something like this. Let's go to our plane in our outliner, which you can see over here. It is hidden right now with this eye icon being off. So let's unhide it, or we could press Alt H to unhide. So our plate is ready. Let's just bring this down to our plane. So we could press number 1 on our numpad, and obviously our plane is on our x-axis directly on the 0, 0 mark. So let's just bring our plate down to that same mark as well. So there we go. What we have here is something like this. So let's add our marble plate now. So let's say Shift A, and then let's add in another plane. Let's bring this plane up, and let's scale this on the x-axis, something like this, and then scale it on the y-axis, something like that. And let's bring this down. Let's go into edit mode, pressing tab, edit mode, selecting a face, and then pressing E to extrude it downwards, something like this. And then let's go back into object mode, and then let's take our plate that we just made and say Shift D to duplicate it. Now that it's selected to our cursor, you can see it's following. We just need to right click so that it snaps back to its original position. And then let's say S for scale and then Y. And let's scale this somewhat like that so that we can make a leg for our plate to stand on. And let's scale it a little bit in the x-axis just to make it shorter. Going into the orthographic view by pressing 3 on the numpad, we can just bring this down a little bit. So pressing G for grab and then Z for the Z axis. And let's just clip it slightly under our plates so that it's just touching this side and this side of our plates. And then pressing G for grab and then the X or the Y axis. And let's just bring this to the side like that. Cool, so now let's just do the other side. For this, it's going to be quite easy. So Shift D, and then pressing G for grab, and then Y. And let's just bring this to the side, just like that. Cool, so now we just got a basic block out of our plates. So now we can get started with the sushi part. So let's start with these little 3 bits over here. So these are basically going to be cylinders. So when it comes to modeling, we always want to think of what is the most basic shape of what we're modeling. So in this case, we're going to be using cylinders. So pressing Shift A, we go to Mesh, and let's go to Cylinder. So without clicking anything, we have this little window pop up. So right now, it's set to 32 vertices. What we're going to do is we're going to half that and make that 16. Because later on we're going to add a subdivision surface which is going to multiply those vertices. So let's scale this down to a reasonable size and bring this up on the Z-axis by pressing G and then Z. And then using our transform tool, we can much better manipulate the position of this. And we can see that we are somewhat in the right place. So I'm going to scale this up just slightly, something like this, and have it there. Now, when we're adding textures and we are using UV maps and we are lighting things and animating things, we just want to make sure that in our scene, our scale, position, and our rotations are applied. In this case, we just used mostly position and scale. So what we can do is we can say Control A to apply. And for now, we can just say all transforms. So right now that locks our origin point back to our 3D cursor. So what we can do is we can right click on our cylinder, set origin to geometry. So you'll see here in your menu, your item menu on the right hand side, that your scale is 1 and that your dimensions and your locations should look similar to what you see over here. So what we can do is, we got 3 of these, so we can say Shift D to duplicate it. So locking it back into its original position, we're just going to drag this slightly to the side, and then we're going to do that one more time, right click, and bring this to the side, just like that. Alright, so somewhat getting there. Alright, so once these are all set, what we can do is we can select all 3 of these. So having the first one selected, holding in Shift, we select all 3, and I think these can just be a little bit shorter, so something like that. While all of these are still selected, I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to go into face mode, and I'm going to select all 3 faces like this, and I'm going to press I to inset, and I'm going to inset these faces somewhat like that, and then I'm going to press E to extrude. Without clicking anything, I'm just going to drag my mouse up slightly, and that's going to bring these little top parts a little bit out. Going back into object mode, let's make sure that this is looking good. Alright, so blocking phase is getting there. So let's add these 2 parts. So I think these are cubes. So what we can do is we can add in a cube like this, go into edit mode, let's scale this down and then bring it up just like that, and then using our transform tool, let's bring it to the side and scale it down a little bit again and get this into position. I think this can be scaled down a little bit and scaled on our y-axis like that, and it is a little bit bigger, so we can do something like that. And then what we can do is go into object mode, we can Shift D this, and we can see our origin is not set to our geometry, so we can right click here, so set geometry, origin to geometry, and the same for this one, origin to geometry, and then position these accordingly so that we got something that matches somewhat to our reference. Alright, So we can see that there's a top part as well. So we can take this and we can say Shift D, bring it up, scale it down, and do the same for the other side. Now it doesn't have to be the exact same size, it doesn't have to be perfect, but got something looking like this. Alright, so next let's add our bowl. So our bowl, we can think, alright, that's spherical, so that's going to be half a sphere. So what we can do is we can say Shift A, add in a UV sphere. Now what we can do is we can press / to isolate this. So / that would isolate it. If you don't have that on your keyboard and it's not working, what we could do is in our outliner we can select all our layers that is not our sphere, and we can just hide them by hovering over their eye in the outliner, and that hides them for us. Or we could select our sphere and then press Ctrl I, and that selects everything but our sphere, and we can press H to hide all of it. Now this gives us a bit better view of our sphere. So what we can do is here, we can go into front view by pressing 1, or we could press it on our widget over here if you're using a laptop. You can go into the different side views using these Z, X, and Y axes buttons. So having our sphere selected, let's go into edit mode, and let's go into wireframe mode by pressing this little button over here, or we can press Z and go into wireframe mode. And what that allows us to do is to select our faces, but also select the faces at the back. If I was not to have wireframe mode on, I would only be able to select the faces that is seen in my view. As you can see over here, the back faces aren't selected. So that is why we go into wireframe view. Select our faces like this, just half of it because we're making a bowl, and we can press X and not delete vertices or edges, but we need to delete faces. So now we got something looking like a bowl. So what we can do at this point is go back into solid view mode. Let's select these faces at the bottom. So what we can do is we can press C, and we can hover over or paint in these faces that we want to get rid of. And we can press X and delete those faces. So what we want to do is we want to create the bottom of the bowl so that it's like that it can stand on a flat surface. So what we can do is we can press 2, or we can go into our edge view or our edge mode, and we can hold in Alt and select the edges. And what we can do is we can scale this up a little bit with S, and then we can extrude this down. Right now if I press E and I try and extrude it, it will just go into a free mode. But if I press Z, it will go lock into that axis. So what we can do is we can just bring it down a little bit, and then we can scale it so that we get something like that. And there you go. Got a basic bowl. So right now it is not closed. So what we can do is, with our edges selected right now, we can press F to fill, and that just gives it a bottom face. It's not completely necessary because we won't see it in our camera view, but for now it's going to work just fine. So if we want to unhide everything, we're going to press Alt H in object view. That brings everything back. So our bowl is quite big right now, so let's just drag it up, and in edit mode or object mode we can just scale it down. In object mode you'd have to scale it down and then apply the scale, but in edit mode we are actually manipulating its actual mesh, and we don't have to change its or apply its scale. But for demonstration purposes, let's scale it down in object mode, and let's bring it down somewhat like this. And if we go into one of our side view modes, I'm just going to hide this reference for now. I'm going into one of the side views, and we just want to see that our bowl is just slightly above, slightly touching our plate, so that it's not hovering or clipping inside of it. Another easy way of helping you to get something that to lock to a face is if you go up here to your snapping tool, and right now it's on increment. If we choose face, what that allows us to do is when we move this around, it will snap to a face for us. So right now Blender's trying to figure out how to snap this to the face. Sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error, but if we get the right moment, the right time, it will snap to the face. And right now we can see the origin point is here at the top, so we can right click on it and we can say set origin to geometry, and there you go. So in my reference, over here you can see the bolt is quite small, so I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. This is for our soy sauce, and let's just snap this back to its face. Control A, scale, just making sure all my transforms, all my scales, and my origin is perfect in center and where it should be. Pressing Alt A to deselect everything, or you could say double tap A to deselect or select everything. I want to make sure that I've got a free mode now. Nothing selected, nothing is in the way of me creating a new object. Alright, so let's create the wasabi. So that is quite simple. That's going to be a sphere that we just squash down. So I'm going to say Shift A and add in a UV sphere. We can keep our segments to 32 for now. So what we can do is we can scale this down, bring this a little bit up, scale it down again, bring it down a little bit, and then scale this on the Z axis, squash it down a little bit. And that's just going to make a little wasabi for us. It's not 100% realistic, but people will get the idea. And for this, we can clip it a little bit into the plate. You can imagine that wasabi kind of squashes when you put pressure on it. So, and when we create the lighting, the shadow will cover anything that looks like it's clipping through a mesh. And I think that's looking great. Alright, so next we need to create our chopsticks. So to create the chopsticks, we can use 2 cubes. So let's create 1 cube for now, like this, scale it down, and move it. What we can do is scale it down to quite a small part. So I'm going to say 0.03, like that on all of them. So if I drag select on these 3 numbers, or if I hover over them and I drag over all 3, I can manipulate all 3 numbers at the same time. So I'm going to say 0.03 so that we get the tip. And what we can do is, in edit mode, we can select the front face of this chopstick, or the back face, and we can drag it out on the y-axis. So this is not extruding it, but it's just dragging the face out. And that gives us a length of our chopstick. So right now you can see that one side is thinner and the other side is thicker. So with this face selected, we're just going to press S for scale and scale it up a little bit. Something like that. And let's scale this face a little bit in, just like that. So we get the right size. I'm going to bring this out a little bit. And there you go. Go back into object mode. We can see our origin point is over there. So that's fine. So we can put our snapping tool on and we can snap it onto the face of our plates. What that does is it snaps this thicker part first and actually leaves this thinner part a little bit above the plate. And that's not what we want. What we can do here is we can reset our origin point to the geometry, and we can rotate it a little bit on the X or the Y, actually the X axis. In one of our front views, I'm just going to drag my reference here, or the side view, we can just slightly place it without the snapping tool on onto our plate, something like that. and then you can see in our reference that it's slightly rotated on the Z axis. So I'm going to press R for rotate and then Z, and I'm going to rotate this slightly. And then let's duplicate this chopstick by pressing Shift D and then right clicking and then bringing it out, and let's rotate it on the Z axis in the opposite direction and place it something like that. So right there we just got the basic blocking. The flowers we'll add in at the end when we start rendering. Basically we've set up our basic blocking of our meshes, and next we're going to add the modifiers. Okay, so in this next part we're going to be adding the modifiers to our objects. So the workflow can be different for different artists. Usually I like to block things out and then add my modifiers afterwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a bevel on these plates. So what you can see, what I've already done is I've added a bevel to this, and what a bevel does is it takes a sharp corner, 90-degree angle, and it makes it round. So a bevel, as you can think, it will take this corner and make it a bit rounder. So I'm going to get rid of these modifiers so long, and let's do this from scratch. So we take our plates, and in object mode we can take a section of it and we can add a modifier here on the right hand panel. Make sure that you're on the blue spanner, the modifier properties. So when we add a modifier, we can see a whole list pops up, and it might be daunting at first, but all these have a certain function in Blender. As you can see by a name, array, bevel, boolean, build, or displace, or dynamic paint, they all do their own little thing. So you can see it here at the top of the menu. There's categories: modify, generate, deform, and physics. So those are the different sections of modifiers that you can work with. Today we're just going to be working with the bevel and the subdivision surface. Those are the most two common ones when it comes to modeling and making meshes and that kind of thing. So for now, let's add a bevel to our plate. So as you can see, it makes the two corners come together, or it makes like these triangles on the corners. So what that does is, if you haven't applied your scale, you would see that you have a different outcome. So make sure that you applied your scale before you add the bevel. So we can see here, if we play with the amount, that we get a very sensitive outcome. So what we need to do is we need to hold in shift when we drag this slider over here. So that helps us just control the amount better, because we're working with nano or very small amounts of units in this bevel. So what we can do is, I say we can bevel it to about 0.013, and what we can do for these bottom parts are, if we select them, holding in shift, select them, select the main part, which is the beveled one, and we can press Ctrl L, and what that does is it does a link and transfer data menu. And what we can do is we can say copy modifiers. So that's going to take the modifiers from your last selected object or your main object, and it's going to apply those modifiers to your other selected objects. So we can say copy modifiers, and we get the same for both. So what we can do here is, as well, is we can add segments to this. So adding a segment will add in another corner for our section. So the higher you go, the more smooth it's going to get. Usually what I like to do is I don't go too high with these segments, because that can cause your scene to lag quite a bit. If you've got a really strong computer, that's fine, you can add more segments, but usually I work between 3 segments and 6 segments, and that's usually enough, because once you shade smooth things and once you texture them, you don't really see those sharpish corners. So I'm just going to add 3 for now, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click this object, and I'm just going to say shade smooth, and what that does is it just creates a smooth shade across our object. Now that's not a shader or a texture, it's just a viewport setting. So what we can do for this as well, for these 2 legs, is we can add 3 segments for each, and we can shade smooth them. Alright, and then that's your plate. So moving on to our sushi part, so what I did was I deleted the other 2, and I'm just keeping this one for now. In the blocking phase, you can play around with your mesh and where it is at. It's just to visualize where your things are going to be for now. But essentially, what we can do to this now is we can add in subdivision surface, and you can see that we lose our shape. So what the subdivision does is it takes all your corners or your edges and it rounds it as, or calculates it to rounded parts. So what Blender does is it tries and smooths it out according to the amount of edges that you have. So now to regain our shape again, let's go into edit mode and let's add in an edge loop. So to add in an edge loop, I'll say Control R. And what that does is if I right click or left click, that's going to add in a edge loop for us. And you can see if I move it around without left clicking, I've got free reign to where I want to place this edge loop. And you can see that it's adding or giving our shape back to our sushi roll. So wherever this edge loop is, what Blender does is it's going to try and calculate where the subdivision is going to smooth that section. So you can imagine now when you're making a more advanced model that you want to have your edge loops and your supporting edge loops in the right sections. Otherwise your whole mesh is just going to look super round and super smooth because of the subdivision. So to place this curve or this edge loop, we just left click. If you want to place it smack bang in the middle, you just right click and that's going to snap it into the middle of that selection. But if you want to move this down, we can use the move tool. But what I recommend is that we double tap G. So if I press G twice, it's going to move it on its normal axis, and we can move it down to, let's say, around where it touches the plate. So now what we can imagine is we want if we can see in our reference over here that our salmon is a little bit more defined. So if I switch off my subdivision surface, you can see that my salmon's quite big over here and we want to give more space for the rice. So what I'm first do is I'm going to select these 2 edges by holding in Shift and Alt, and I'm going to scale this down a little bit, something like that, and I'm going to press Control R to add an supporting edge loop here by the rice. If I didn't do that, this is what it would look like. It's still going to look very round. So you can get the idea that whenever we add an edge loop, it gives more definition to our mesh, or gives more curvature. And you can see if I select a face here and I inset it, we get a bit more definition in our shape. So you can go crazy with your edge loops and add in a lot, but at the end of the day you want to try and keep things to a reasonable mesh, so that it's not too high poly. Otherwise it's going to slow down your computer or it slows down your render. So we always want to keep things or add edge loops when necessary. So right now we can see that our sushi is looking pretty good, and what we can do now is go back into object mode. I just wanted to switch on my preferences again because I did lose it for some reason. Save preferences. I'm going to go back into edit mode or object mode, and I'm going to just Alt D instead of Shift D. So what Alt D is, it just makes an instance of this object. It's the same object linked to this. So if I make changes to this object, it's going to change this one. So you can see here, if I change it in edit mode, it's going to change that object as well because it's an instance. If I was to Shift D this, just duplicate it, now it's its own object and it doesn't draw from its original object anymore. So what that does is it saves space on your scene, and it helps to keep things nice and clean when it comes to the memory data in your project. So I'm going to duplicate that and place it in the right sections. Alright, so moving on to the bowl, we can think, okay, well, we've got thickness to it, and right now our bowl looks quite flat and paperish. So what we can do is, in our modifiers, we're not going to use a bevel and we're not going to use a subdivision surface because that's not going to help us give thickness. We can use a thing called a solidify, and the solidify is here just above subdivision surface. So if I add a solidify, you can see now that it's actually like make our mesh look thicker. And you can see here by thickness, if I drag this up and down holding in shift just to keep it more precise, we can add thickness to our bowl over here. So we want to keep in mind that we have an offset of -1. So if I change this to 1, we're just changing it in a different direction. So we can keep our offset at -1 for now, and we can just give some thickness to our bowl. Because if you think about it, if it's a +1, it's going outwards, and if it's -1, it's going inwards. So I'm just going to give this bowl thickness of 0.1013 meters, and that looks good. So let's go on to our bigger sushi parts, and you can see how we've got our blockouts. So you can imagine now we can add a bevel to this, and we can add a subdivision to this. But let's see what happens if we just added a subdivision. So I'm going to select my rice part, and I'm going to add a subdivision in. And you can see we've completely lost our shape. And that's because we don't have any supporting edge loops. So now what the bevel does is it adds in the supporting edge loops for us. So if I add in a bevel, you can see, okay, well, we still don't get what our shape needs to look like. But that's because in the modifiers, it depends on how it's stacked. So if you have your bevel underneath your subdivision, it's first going to apply the subdivision and then the bevel. So what's nice about Blender is you can rearrange these modifiers by holding in the little window at the top right of it, and you can drag it on top of each other. So you can see here is now if we add in a subdivision and we change our amount of our bevel, we can start to get a decent shape for our rice. So let me just do that from the beginning again. So let's add in a bevel first to add in our supporting edge loops, and let's just bevel this properly so that we get the edges that we want. So you can see that it's quite round, so we can play around with our amounts over here. So 0.031 meters seems fine, and let's add in a section for that, or a segment rather, and then let's add in a subdivision. Now we can see that it gets quite round. So I think one segment is actually enough, and we can add in a levels viewport subdivision to this. So what these numbers do here at the bottom is, right now it's on 1. What it does is it adds in more subdivisions. So if I was to up this number, you can see that I get more mesh and more edges to my data. So now if I was to apply this, you can see that this becomes quite a heavy or a high poly mesh. So I'm just going to Control Z this and undo that and keep this to number 2. So it's levels viewport, that is what we see in our viewport, and in our render, when we render it, it's what it's going to be, what we see over here with number 2. So we want to keep these numbers. Usually if it's at 1, it's just going to help our viewport render a bit better, but if we keep the render at 3, that's what it's going to actually render as. So 2 or 3 should be fine, and if I shade smooth this, we get something like that. So now we can actually get rid of these just as our blockouts, and we can duplicate this by Shift D, and we can scale it down a little bit. And now you can see that we're starting to get our, I don't know what you call this, just rice and salmon sushi. But basically I want this to be a bit more round, so I can adjust my amount of my bevel a little bit, and there you go. So what we can do is we can just move this a little bit to the side and select both of these, and then Shift D, right click to put it back into its, snap it back into its original position, and then just move it to the right a little bit, and there you go. So that is set. So I did add a shade smooth to these. You don't have to, but usually I just like to add a shade smooth just to see what it's gonna what the texture is gonna do to it later on. So we can shade smooth these as well, and because you made an instance of these, you'll see that they all change to shade smooth. Alright, so going to our chopsticks, we can see that they actually don't need that much definition. What we can do is we can add a subdivision to these, but ooh, that's not right. So what we need to do is add in a edge loop to this. So going into edit mode, I'm going to say Control R, and I'm just going to add in edge loops to the ends of these. So I'm just adding an edge loop by pressing Control R and then sliding it to the ends of my chopsticks. So we can do the same for this as well to get in some modeling practice. So without adding in the subdivision, I'm just going to double tap G on this and bring it to the side, add in another one, double tap G there. You can see that I placed my edge loop first and then I double tap G, but you can originally, if you just add it in and left click, you can slide it along like that. But it's good to know both ways. And then we can go to object mode and then add in a subdivision to this. And you can see that in my chopsticks over here, it's quite sharp on the edges. So we can slide this even more to the side. And we can even inset this to make it a bit more squarish. So to inset something, you can select the face and you can press I for inset, and it's going to inset that face for you. And we can do the same on this side. Select the face, inset, and there you go. We've got some roundish chopsticks. Mine aren't so round on this render, but I think that does the job. And for this bowl, we can just add in a shade smooth, and then for this wasabi, we can right click, add in a shade smooth, and there you go. That is our modeling basically done. Now we're going to move on to the texturing phase.